would you verify that the decision that you're making, you're voting for a new or all legislation, supporting all legislation, how do you verify that in fact that is the will of the majority of people?
Well, I don't know that it always is, and I'm not absolutely convinced that my job is to necessarily always reflect the majority. I think it's my job to make decisions that I think are best. I think you don't make decisions that are absolutely inconsistent with a significant amount of your population. But there are times in a democracy when the will of the majority needs to be challenged. And we see that around human rights. We see it around civil rights issues. There are times when that happens. So I think what's important as an elected representative is that when there are challenging decisions, and most decisions aren't all of one view or another, they're divided. And the important thing for me is to be able to go out and understand as best I can those different views and some sense of the magnitude of that support for the different views, and then make the decision and be accountable for it.
Well, when you say that the will of the majority can go wrong, sometimes specifically on human rights issues, there is no evidence that, say, the majority of people wanted to oppress certain race or a certain economic social level. Is there any evidence that you can say the majority of the people will not work because here's a precedent? I mean, let's go just 10 years or 15 years in our lifetime, not Second World War and when people were oppressing the Jews in Germany, but in our lifetime here. Is there any evidence that the majority are going wrong? I've heard sometimes capital punishment, but is there some referendum that can prove that the majority are going in the wrong direction?
Well, you know, I don't even think you need to go back 15 years. I think you can look at today. And if you look at First Nations, and you look at the role of First Nations, who are a minority in raw numbers, there is a constituency out there that's a significant constituency who are not supportive of the inherent rights that First Nations have, rights that I believe they have. I think it has to be a negotiation, rights that the courts believe they have. And have ruled on. But arguably, if you said it is up to the majority, you may well have that majority overruling courts, overruling legislation.
But we don't know that.
So the question, though, is, and I guess the argument is, should the First Nations even be put in a place where they have to deal with that? And I don't necessarily believe they do. I think their rights are inherent. But if it's sheer and raw numbers, you may well have people saying, well, no, we don't believe that. And at some point, you have to protect the integrity of rights. And I believe that's when it becomes important for political leaders and elected representatives to step up and to take a different view. You can look back, you know, and the history is not that long ago. You can look back through the situation with the blacks in the United States. There's lots of examples where that has occurred. And we should learn from our past, otherwise we might repeat it.
Sure, it did occur. Women didn't have the right to vote.
Absolutely.
Blacks didn't have the right. Chinese didn't have the right
to
vote.
There's a long list.
There's the last in the past. But today, 2013, is there a challenge? Maybe some people can argue with you that the inherent rights of some people are racist, and therefore we should review it. So do people have the right to discuss that? And maybe the majority would have a consensus perhaps different than yours.
Oh, they may. And that's why we have some rule of law, and we have the courts. And the courts are the place where those decisions get resolved around whether those rights are legitimate or not. And the role of the legislatures are to protect the integrity of the courts as well. And I don't always like what the courts decide, but I respect the need to protect their integrity.
My question is, how do you make sure that the decision that you are making in the legislature is in fact the decision or the will of the majority of the people?
Again, I think that we have to have our eyes and ears open and be open to as much input as we can get from interested constituents. I also think that in the electronic age and the age of the internet, that we should be able to make more use of electronic participation from people in a riding. I believe that would help. I believe if you could, if you could take the pulse of the constituents by asking for participation electronically, I think that would help.
And taking that pulse, would that be an equivalent to a plebiscite or a referendum?
No. I think that referendums, we are a jurisdiction that offers referendums as an option to constituents, but I think that, first of all, referendums are expensive. They cost a fair bit of money. Secondly, referendums that are offered for complex decisions quite often end up with results that aren't necessarily optimal, because people don't have the time to, or they don't have the attention span sometimes to really
understand the issue properly, so they end up voting on the wrong side.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, it all sounds good, but most politicians say the same thing. We want partnership with the people. We want to hear what the people say. But how do you verify that, in fact, the majority of your constituents, in fact, agree with what you are legislating?
Well, I think I have started a blog talk radio program, and if I was elected as an MLA for Vancouver Falls Creek, I will continue on with a show that is called Have Your Say. It's a BC Politics on any issues.
What radio is that?
That's internet radio station. It's heard throughout the internet. Actually, people from around the world could hear about it.
How do you tune into it?
Just by going through Blog Talk Radio /BC Politics, and the program is called Have Your Say. So in other words, if I can get the message out, which there is a certain budget for an MLA, to get the message out to the constituents, then they can call me up. And it's up to me to go to them, because they lead busy lives as well.
Yeah. Now, how will you measure the pulse of the people? Because you can hear a lot of stuff, but how do people know that what you're hearing is in fact what the majority of people are saying? You see what I mean? It's like politicians usually say, well, you can write me an email, and then how do you know how many emails are against or how many emails are in favor of whatever you're trying to decide?
I think PJ, I think that if an MLA does his job properly, consults with his constituents, by that I mean by having a blog talk radio.
Yeah.
Also, I have a virtual office. They need to know that. That's what I would reduce the expenditures of the MLA, the office, the secretary, and then I could meet one-on-one and also develop a certain core of people within the community on issues, be it the Falls Creek Residents Association that I attended an all-candidates meeting. They're very strong in that area of consulting with the people. They have a Facebook page, they have a website. So with today's technology, that's how you can gauge your public support on any one issue.
You consult, but how do you really gauge? How do you tabulate that will of the people, unless you have a referendum or a plebiscite, perhaps, if it's not an official referendum? You need a polling system where you can verify that the majority of people actually want something.
Well, I believe that how you could possibly do that is by, well, first off, like I said, and I keep repeating myself, consulting, but you'd also have to see, it's on major issues. We're not going to be like California where they do a Proposition 8 for every little issue. It would be issues on major things such as taxation, healthcare, education.
Okay. You said that you wouldn't be asking all questions to the people because it would be too expensive, or?
It would be a very costly expenditure.
Direct democracy to me means that you not only listen, but you also count how many people agree with you or how many people disagree with you. So what I'm thinking is that you need also a polling system where you can actually verify that in fact the majority of people think that way. Not just listen to them, not just talk to them, because that not counting, it leaves the question, how do you know? Who is counting?
Well, you'd have to, like, you can have petitions, online petitions through the internet. So that's one way that we could do that. Another way is to inform them by doing a mail out to the actual people.
Yeah, but informing is not counting the response.
No, okay, the counting of the response obviously would have to, you'd have to see what response you have first. Then it would have to be verified by an independent body if it were to be like an issue such as healthcare, taxation, and education.
So you need a mechanism.
Yes.
A system where people can respond to whatever the issue is.
Yes, absolutely.
So you would develop something like that if you were elected.
Well, that's where Recall and Initiative, that's where we were very, very successful in doing that actual part of it.
Okay. So how are we going to tabulate the public opinion, the number of people that support one way or the other? How are you going to tabulate that? How are you going to make sure that that is what people want rather than the party or the big corporations?
We need to start a dialogue. And we need to start a dialogue that is free from special interests. Mm-hmm. And in order to free ourselves from special interests is to make sure that we put limits on things like campaign fundraising, mm-hmm. on campaign spending. Those things are going to help us find what an MLA truly is. And that way we can encourage our elected MLAs mm-hmm. to actually go into their community, host public forums, invite experts on the issues. For example, if we're talking about transportation, we should get in transportation experts. We have a lot of them here at SFU and UBC. And get those forums and get those public consultations, you know, in their own writing, mm-hmm. with their own constituents.
Okay. I don't know if you remember the BC Health conversation a few years ago. The Liberal Party had this conversation. It was a dialogue mm-hmm. about let's get people engaged, let's find out what people want. At the end of the conversation that went throughout the province and thousands of people participated in it, at the end there was no tabulation, there was no compiling of how many people think this way, how many people want that way. It was just, we heard you, not exactly showing exactly what they heard, but they said we heard, and it went to a box shelf somewhere because I don't think there was any results at the end of it. So when you say we want to have more dialogue, it reminds me of the liberal dialogue on BC healthcare, where people talking is cheap to say yes, let's talk, but in the end, the MLA or the government has the power to make decisions. So the fact that they listen to people doesn't mean that they're going to do what people want. So my question is, how can you make sure that what the government is doing is in fact the will of the majority of the people?
The government said that they listened, but they didn't take those things that they heard into the decision-making process, and that is because they have too much special interest behind them. Okay. There are large institutions and organizations that have more leverage on this government than the people they're trying to listen to. So it's a systematic problem. It's inherent, but we can fix that by reforming our electoral process.
And how are you going to reform it?
So the Green Party, we want to prevent special interests by making sure that during the campaign period we put limits on how much you can fundraise. And we also want to make sure that we return to a model where political parties get funding through by achieving a number of votes, for example, 10% of the vote, and we should be able to get funding for the votes that because we're showing that people are supporting us. That is a better way, because that compensates for political parties who didn't get the favor of the special interest groups. And then the other thing is that our political system is kind of in a place where we are dominated by these two large political parties. And even if there are people within those political parties who want to change, they face extreme difficulty. There is what I've just mentioned, the party whip. Because the organizations become so large that the power is concentrated in the Premier's office. Individual MLAs really have very little to say aside from the campaign period.
So how would you change that?
So we want to continue the dialogue after the campaign period, after the election.
I hear you say that the financial contributions to candidates is very crucial, and you would limit those things. And the next thing is that you wouldn't like to have parties with the party whip that tells people in their party to go one way or the other. That you're a group of individuals, and that way that the power is more distributed and to decentralized in a way, rather than what we have now. We have just one more minute, and one last question is, you remember the recall and initiative legislation that your colleague Ujaldo Sanj brought in 1996. Do you think that it's workable? Do you think that should be changed or enhanced or abolished?
Well, I think it's there, and I don't think it's going anywhere, and I think it should remain. And for the longest time, I will tell you, I was not a believer that it was that it could work. And the HST proved to all of us that, in fact, it can work, and that that initiative can work. And so I think that's a very positive thing. And it was one of the remarkable, and it changed politics in this province well into the future. So I think it can work. Might it be tweaked in ways that make it improve it? Sure, there might be some room for that. I don't disagree with that. But I think it does work, and I don't think it's going anywhere.
So you like recall? An initiative?
Well, I think recall's legitimate. Particularly, I don't support the notion that you recall somebody because you don't like the decision they made on something. But I support recall where it's about people who have made serious errors in terms of their own judgment or their own ethics and things. I think that's the time. I think otherwise you recall them when you elect them.
So there was recall and initiative legislation brought by the NDPs in 1996. Do you think that it works well the way it is, or do you think it should be abolished, or do you think it should be enhanced?
Well, I think that there were probably more cases where there should have been a recall than there have been. You know, recall legislation has only been successful in 1 or 2 cases in the last 20 years since it's been around. So I would say that there probably could be some enhancements to it. I think we're one of the few jurisdictions in the Commonwealth actually that has recall legislation. I don't think recall legislation should be used and abused it shouldn't be used on a wide scale, which would lead to abuse. I think that, you know, sometimes people have to make unpopular decisions in order to get things done.
But the question is, what we have, do you think is working fine, or should we abolish it, or should we improve it?
No, I don't think we should abolish it. I think we should look at improving it a little bit so that it is possible where a politician is breaking an election promise or doing something that it's agreed that they don't have the social license to do. I believe that there should be that legislation in place so that we can take them out of office if they don't do what's expected of them. However, there should be clear parameters in place to make sure that that legislation is not abused.
How could it be abused?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
And and the other question is, what would be those improvements? You said it should be improved. What do you have in mind? How would it be improved? How could it be improved?
Well, I think as I've looked through how the legislation works, it's fairly complex. It's quite complicated, you know, and it's not easy to work through. So I think it should be a little bit easier to work through, a little bit simpler.
Yeah, they require 40% of signatures to sign a petition of recall, 40% signatures of people that have voted in the last election, and the United States, I think it's 10%
Yeah.
in some of the states.
Yeah.
Do you think that lowering that threshold would
Yes.
be better?
Yep. I think that you're lucky to get 40% of the people out to vote these days. So, you know, if that's the case, then we have to look at reducing the threshold for the people that might want to sign a recall.
Yeah. Going to recall an initiative, Ujaldo Sanja in 1996 brought that legislation, and some people like it, some people think that it's not a good legislation because the threshold of how many people make a petition to recall someone is too high. You need 40% of constituents to ask for a recall, and they think it's too high. Do you think that it should be lowered?
Absolutely.
To what?
To 25% of registered voters, and not necessarily from who voted. It should be 25 of registered voters, whether they voted last time or not. That gives them a good threshold. So that's what it should definitely be lowered to.
There are places in the United States that have 10%, the threshold. Do you think that's too low?
That may be a little bit too low, because you can't just get rid of an MLA. I mean, if you had 10 people that didn't like an MLA for his particular stance on one single issue, then you know his job would end, because those sort of 10 people would.
Well, when I say 10%, it doesn't mean 10 people.
No.
But 10% of people that are objecting this person being an MLA would start a recall. And the recall, you would need the majority of constituents to agree with those 10%. So you would have to go maybe 40, 50, 60% of people saying, yeah, in fact, you are not doing a good job. So it's not 10 people, but...
No, the way the current recall and initiative legislation is enacted is too far. We tried to do the recall. It wasn't as successful as the petition. If a person wanted to recall, I'll take myself for an example, they would need 25% of registered voters, and it would also have to be something like a secret ballot vote. That you have to begin the seed of change to change legislation. That is, the thresholds are way too high for even to encounter that. The only reason that we were successful initially in the initiative, or the citizens petition rather, was because the people were behind it. They kept asking Fight HST supporters to actually, you know, just set up the locations, we'll come to you.
So you're saying that if you were elected, you would enhance the recall and initiative legislation to lower the threshold on,
Yes.
on referendum, and also on initiative. Initiative is 10%, you need to start an initiative. So you would lower that too?
Yes, but we would have 10% in an initiative vote, but through 6 regions, main regions throughout the province, be it the Lower Mainland, Vancouver Island, the Okanagan, way up north, and also you would have to have somewhat of a 10% threshold in the main areas like the Lower Mainland, so that one area couldn't pin itself against another area because the population is bigger.
Yeah. So you're redrawn the boundaries of ridings. Are you planning to have 6 ridings instead of 18?
No, this would be the ridings encompassing those regions. So there would be, maybe in the Okanagan, there could be 4 constituencies.
I think STB had some similar redistribution of boundaries, and they had, like, instead of 80, would have about 20 ridings or something. You remember?
Yeah, I did remember that. A lot of people, including yours truly, I didn't quite understand STV. Yeah. And I agree that we need to look at the system of first past the post, proportional representation could be something, but you have to consult with the people. Yeah. And I believe that an MLA should be doing that. That's part of his job, his mandate. That's what he does. Instead of just sitting in the house, closing your mouth, we don't have to toe the party line in BC First.
Great. Well, thank you very much for coming, and I wish you well.
And I'd just like to also remind your listeners that Bill Vander Zalm, the former premier, wrote a book about the HST and the People for Democracy, how it worked, and the process that we followed, and how in future generations this is actually a historical book.
All right. Well,
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good luck. So, is there any other way that you would try to implement direct democracy besides those two that you already told me? That financial contributions limited, and limited the power of the party leader and the party's policies to decentralize to individuals. Is there something else that you would advocate for?
Well, in one of your questions, I noticed that you've mentioned the recall and initiative legislation. That itself is it is an important piece of legislation that could be better utilized. It could become an effective tool to promote democracy. But currently it lacks clarity. And what we need to do is to add clarity to the process, as well as the criteria for recall and initiative.
So what do you think the criteria should be for a recall?
Well, first of all, the criteria we should clarify, and we want to. There are a few points that are important, I think. One is that we need a majority, but the majority for
we work in majority in elections, so we need majority.
But the majority, it has to be. We have to be able to find majority across the province. It shouldn't be we have a majority in the Lower Mainland, but not in the rest of the province. I don't think that's a good thing to do. I think we need to make sure that we don't pit one region against the other, because we do live in a very diverse province, and it's a large province.
So majority should be considered universal in the whole province, perhaps, rather than just in one area.
One idea would be to have regions rather than having ridings, but we have regions for this purpose, and to make sure that we achieve majority in all of the regions.
There are many reasons and excuses to dismiss the need for shifting from representative democracy to direct democracy. But when a significant number of us, the citizens, realize the need and the possibility of changing the political system, we will start legislating our own shadow constitution. How do we do that? One possibility is suggested on this little booklet, Perpetual Direct Democracy, published by Amazon.com, but you can also read it for free online on our website, pacific.ca.